The road to the village curled like a thin ribbon around the mountains, a single lane carved into stone and patience. When the bus finally sighed to a stop, Juchingi stepped down with a suitcase, a rolled canvas tube, and the kind of quiet that follows a long winter inside a person. The air was colder than she'd prepared for, even in late spring. Pine needles stitched the wind with a resinous sweetness. Bells from somewhere higher chimed a small, practical music. The owner of the rental cabin had left a key beneath a flat stone, taped in a plastic bag. The note inside was brief: firewood stacked. Water line runs slow. Mind the north wall. She pressed the key into the lock and paused when it turned, because the metal sounded like a throat clearing, as if the house had something to say before letting her in. The door opened on a scent of turpentine and old winters. The front room was spare: a stove, a pine table nicked by decades, 2 chairs that had learned to lean toward each other in conversation. Light fell through a tall window aslant, a pale rake across the floorboards. She left her suitcase near the door and tested each plank by stepping on it, listening for the complaints that reveal a place's age. The house was not unfriendly. It felt like a pause you enter instead of a room. Then she saw the first canvas. It hung on the far wall, unframed, its edges fastened with rusted pushpins. A portrait, the suggestion of a woman's face, sketched in long graphite gestures and breaths of thinned oil brows, only half decided. Eyes left in primer white, mouth a hesitation of color. The woman looked like her. Not precisely, but unmistakably near. The slope of the cheek, the way the hair fell into the eye and refused neatness. The ear, carefully rendered, with a small crescent scar at the lobe. Juchingi lifted a hand to her own ear. The crescent scar was there, a childhood bicycle, a corner of a fence. She did not move for a long moment. Then she walked the house. The bedroom, 2 more canvases, propped along the baseboard. One was only a palette of blues and ash gray, rain taught to stand still. The other held a pair of hands that could have been hers, or anyone's, held out as if testing rain. The kitchen, a stack of primed boards, a jar of bristle-bruised brushes, a coffee tin rattling with screws, nails, and 3 small pine cones, as if someone had confused repair with worship. Above the sink hung another portrait, again that not quite her, again the half-made features, this time catching a grin that hadn't reached its mouth yet. She returned to the front room because there is always a first painting. There is always a first question to which the house demands an answer. Under the portrait was a pencil line on the wall, a measured horizon. Above it, faint notes: cat yell plus white, lose the line, remember wind. Remember wind, she read aloud, and heard the stove metal tick, the pine outside shrug. A knock came, then 3 even taps. She turned. The door was still open, a wedge of afternoon set in wood, and in its frame stood a tall man with a square, careful posture, a knitted cap, and the posture of someone deciding whether to apologize for something not yet done. "Sorry," he said, as if completing a thought. "I saw the smoke. The chimney? It tends to choke if you light it without opening the flue." "I haven't lit it," she said. "Good," he said, relieved as if spared to death. "May I?" He stepped in only after she stepped back. He moved like people who know houses, shoulders slightly lowered, steps landing on boards that could take weight. At the stove, he tugged a lever she hadn't noticed and then set the lever exactly halfway. "There, thank you," she said. He nodded. He didn't offer a hand, and she was grateful not to be asked to decide whether to take it. He nodded toward the portrait. "It still looks like you," he said, as if greeting a fact. She made a choice to meet the fact without flinching. "Still." He blinked once, as if the word had revealed a seam in his sentence. "I mean, the resemblance is strong." He glanced around, not searching, more like remembering the room in front of her. "You found the note about the north wall?" "I did." She looked at the portrait. "Is this the north wall?" He looked at the window, thought about the mountain's shoulder, and lifted his chin toward the painting. "Yes. Is it yours?" she asked. He considered the question, or the manners of it. "Some are," he said. "Some aren't. Most are unfinished." "The house seems haunted by unfinished things," she said lightly. then heard the seriousness in her own voice, like a bruise beneath cloth. He noticed, but didn't touch it. "There's tea," he said, nodding to the kitchen. "If the tin still holds anything. If not, the shop closes in 20 minutes. "Let me check," she said. The tin held 3 folded tea sachets of a brand she knew only from train stations. She heated water and found 2 cups. When they sat at the table, the light had lowered a setting. The portrait on the wall gained more face from shadow than from paint. "Were you the last to live here?" she asked. "Yes," he said, not quite meeting the question in the eyes. "Before I moved down by the mill. It's warmer there. The chimney listens better. Did you paint these?" She gestured toward the walls. It felt crude, and yet not asking felt crude. He set his cup down, polite with the saucer. "I tried to. There was a set of studies. Discipline." He lifted a hand to his own ear without meaning to, a quick touch that matched hers from earlier. "I wanted to catch the way a face changes when it's thinking and not being watched." He grimaced. "Which is a terrible way to paint." "It looks like me," she said. "It does," he agreed. "That's why I thought I should come say hello. Not to be strange. To acknowledge if you were uneasy." "I'm not uneasy," she lied, but gently, as if speaking to a child. "Only curious." "Curiosity is what opens the flue," he said. "Then the fire has somewhere to go." They drank their tea. He told her the shop sold good bread when the baker's nephew visited. That clouds here came in from Italy, as if the Alps were a door that learned to swing. He spoke like someone building a small bridge and checking each plank. She told him she had come to work, to make work that did not apologize for being work. That cities had turned her into a surface that reflected other people's faces too, that the mountain, she hoped, would give her angles again. "Angles," he repeated, as if tasting the word for grain. "You'll get them. The light here is stingy but honest." When he left, the room felt larger, not emptier. She set her suitcase on the bed and unpacked the practical things: socks, sweaters, the little box with tubes of paint, and the more expensive brushes wrapped in linen like bones inside cloth. She stood at the window to test the mountain's shade on each color, rotating a palette knife in the pail to see whether it bent or held. Dusk found her with a pencil in hand before the portrait on the north wall. She had not meant to touch it. It wasn't hers. But the eye left blank had the gravity of a missing word in a sentence you cannot read without supplying. She lifted the pencil, paused a hair's breadth from the canvas, and let the graphite make a breath of gray in the corner of the iris, not finishing, only admitting that seeing had occurred. Behind her, the floorboard near the stove clicked wood cooling. In the window's dark, her reflection gathered the room into itself, the table and the cups, the suitcase half emptied, the woman who looked like the woman on the wall but was not that woman, because she was moving, because she was breathing. There were more canvases to find. She lifted the rug by the stove and discovered 2 panels slid beneath like letters too large for envelopes. On the first, a shoulder and collarbone, tenderly mapped, an anatomy of weather and heat. On the second, the back of a head, hair parted like a road. Notes ran in the margins again. "Don't fix the mouth. Let the pine choose the green. Wind reads faces too." She laughed once, the sound of a lock turning. "Wind reads faces too," she said to the room. "Good. Then it can read mine." She pinned a fresh ground to the opposite wall, the south, where the last light insists on telling the truth before it leaves. She drew a rectangle that felt like a door she could open later. She wrote one small word in the lower corner, began then scrubbed it out with her thumb, and left only the smudge that proved a start. When night was full, she put on her coat and went outside. The pines held the dark, the way hands hold water, carefully and briefly. In the sky, the mountain's silhouette leaned against a deeper black. A window glowed in a house farther down, a square of honey. She wondered if it was Pay's. She wondered if he was painting tonight or refusing to. From the doorframe she looked back at the north wall, at the not quite her watching from primer and shadow. She lifted a hand in a small salute. "I don't know who you were meant to be," she said, "but I'll decide who I am here." The chimney drew well when she lit the fire. The room took on that expedient warmth cabins know, where heat is a verb and not a condition. She boiled water again, stood with her hip against the table. and watched the portrait until the portrait began to watch back, which is the moment real work begins. The house breathed around her wood, wind, and something like a held note at the edge of hearing. She let it remain unfinished. She let herself be, too. The first morning came, wrapped in the hush that only mountains can invent. Light arrived not as brightness but as temperature, slow, deliberate, almost shy. Gu Qingyi woke to the smell of pine smoke and coffee. For a brief, dazed moment, she thought she had dreamed both, until the sound of footsteps on gravel corrected her. She opened the door. Pei stood outside with a metal thermos and a loaf of bread wrapped in a newspaper dated 3 days ago. "Morning," he said. His voice carried the calm of someone who had already spoken to the world before speaking to people. "You read my mind," she said. "Coffee," he nodded. "And bread. The bakery opens late on Mondays." She stepped aside for him to come in. The cabin seemed slightly less cautious around him, like a dog remembering an old friend. He set the thermos on the table, unscrewed the cap, and poured 2 tin cups. Steam rose between them, ghosts that had no business haunting anyone. "I didn't want to intrude," he said, but the shop clerk said the new tenant looked pale. "She must have seen me through the window." She smiled. "I'm not used to altitude, or quiet," he said. She met his eyes. Maybe both. They ate the bread in slow, practical silence. The crust flaked like old paper. The center was still soft, still forgiving. Through the window, light sifted through the pines, painting the air in vertical strokes. She asked, "What do you do now, down by the mill?" He hesitated. "I fix things. Machines mostly. Sometimes wood and paintings." He took a breath as if measuring something invisible. "Not lately, why not?" The faces stopped speaking back. She tilted her head. "Maybe they're waiting for you to listen differently." That seemed to unsettle him gently, like a hand brushing dust from an old photograph. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the wall. "You worked late," he said. She followed his gaze to the new canvas she'd pinned on the south wall. It was barely begun, a rectangle of gesso and 2 lines, one vertical, one curved, like a breath that couldn't decide whether to stay or leave. "I only started," she said. "That's how everything starts," he said. Then he noticed something else. The faint smudge where she had written "begin" and rubbed it away. He smiled, not the full kind, but the quiet, knowing kind that belongs to people who've failed enough to recognize effort. "The south wall's a good choice," he said. "Light's kinder there." "You talk about light like it's a person." "Sometimes it is," he said simply. They finished their coffee, and he rose, leaving the newspaper on the table. When she reached for it, she noticed the back page had a photograph. A local art fair, 2 years old. In the corner of the frame, a man stood beside a display of wooden frames and unfinished sketches. His eyes in the photo were younger, almost uncertain, and beside him one of the same portraits that now hung on her north wall. She looked up at him. "You were showing these?" He shrugged. "Trying to. Why didn't you finish them?" He met her gaze then. "Because sometimes you stop painting before the truth appears. Otherwise, you'd have to admit you see it." The words lingered between them, soft but heavy. She didn't push further. Some truths shouldn't be asked to wake up all at once. After he left, she stayed at the table, fingers tracing the coffee ring on the wood. She could hear the mountain breathe slow, content, unashamed of silence. The air carried a promise of rain. She turned toward the north wall again. The woman in the painting seemed closer now, her unfinished face alive with a question that hadn't been there yesterday. Gu Qingyi picked up her brush. "Let's find out what you were trying to say," she whispered. Outside, wind moved through the pines, and the house listened. Rain arrived like a careful visitor, coat brushed, voice lowered, then settled in for the day. Gu Qingyi welcomed it. Rain taught the mountain to speak softly. She placed a chair by the south wall and tuned the room. A kettle set to sing but not boil. Rags folded, brushes combed and breathing. Outside, the pines wrote their vertical script on the window. Inside, she mixed a quiet gray from ultramarine and a reluctant yellow, then softened it with the white she saved for changes of mind. When the knock came, it was not a knock. It was a thumb against wood, a hello shaped to the weather. Pei stood there, damp at the shoulders, holding a bundle of narrow boards tied with twine. Frames, he said. From the mill offcut. Thought they might fit your studies. She stepped aside. The cabin liked him more in the rain. He leaned the boards against the table and unwrapped them like bread. Pale spruce, sanded smooth, the ends square as a good sentence. They're beautiful, she said. They're honest, he corrected, but smiled. They worked in companionable order. He measured the north wall and found its old grudge's nails sunk at wrong angles, a hook that no longer trusted its screw. She sorted boards by grain, by the way each one held light. They spoke only when purpose required it. Yes, chisel, left of the stove, careful, always. At noon the rain loosened into a noon-gray mist. Steam rose from both cups, from both mouths when they laughed once at nothing. She asked about his work with wood, and he told her small things that grew large when said aloud. How knots hold memories the saw cannot read. How some boards bow toward the light even after the tree is gone. What about faces? She asked finally, gentle. Do they bend? They do, he said. Toward whatever forgives them. He set a miter joint like a handshake, and reached for the glue he trusted. She held the corner square while he pressed, and in that small geometry she understood why frames matter. Not to trap, but to promise boundaries that keep a picture from getting lost. The kettle hummed, turned its note, fell quiet. The room wore its rain the way a person wears a familiar coat. They had gone out together in harder weather. Tell me about your city, he said, still looking at the joint. What you left. Noise, she said, but not unkindly, and speed, and a way of looking that turned every object into a surface for reflection. I want to paint weight again. Things that stop light, or hold it seriously. He nodded. Weight is patient. It waits to be understood. She smiled. Do you always talk like this? Only on rainy days, he said. They let the glue set and walked the room. Two caretakers reading a house. The window swelled from damp. He showed her how to shave a prayer-thin curl from the sash, so it would open without complaint. She sanded gently and listened to the music of friction. He tightened the door latch an eighth of a turn, and suddenly the click sounded like agreement. They ate bread and soup at the table, her soup, his bread. Carrot onion, time that someone had forgotten to finish tying in a string. He fished it out with the tip of a knife, and left it beside his cup like a small green comma. May I? He asked, and nodded to the south wall. Please. He stood before the new canvas, the one with its single vertical and the curved undecided breadth. He did not move close. He kept the respectful distance of a person before a window at night. It knows what it is, he said, almost to himself. It's already made a promise. What promise? That the rest will be lighter than the first mark. She considered that. I'm not sure I trust light that much. Then let the dark be kind, he said, and stepped back. When he returned to the table, she was rubbing her thumb along a pine shaving he had left on the wood. It had dried into a loose spiral, tight at the center, opening at the edge. She lifted it against the window and watched the rain through it. The mountain blurred into a softer mountain. What does your day look like down by the mill? She asked. He told her about the belts that carried wood-like songs, the careful knives, the smell that lived in his clothes when he came home. He told her he liked repair more than invention, that making something whole felt truer than making something new. Maybe that's why you stopped painting, she said. Maybe, he agreed. The afternoon thinned. They worked again. He cut another length. She set another nail. The portrait on the north wall changed without changing. Perhaps it had learned to share the room. She decided not to touch it today. Some conversations are improved by listening. Will you show at the fair again? She asked, a question sent like a paper boat in easy water. Not this year, he said. Maybe when the faces speak. And if they don't, he looked at her, then at the window, where the mist had turned to a finer script. Then I'll learn to listen differently. They finished the last frame at dusk. He laid it flat to cure and weighed it with the newspaper that had carried his younger self. Rain had thinned to the smallest sound a roof can make. She lit the lamp a low, amber patience. The room offered itself as evening. Before I go, he said, one more repair. He crossed to the stove and opened the small ash door below the grate. "It draws better this way," he said. "Houses like to breathe from the bottom." "So do people," she said. They stood there, two people beside a small red square of fire. When the draft steadied, the flame stopped flickering at its edges and settled into work. "Tomorrow," he said, suddenly awkward, "if you like, there's a place where the pines part and the lake shows its whole face." "Morning is best." "Morning then," she said. He gathered his tools. At the door he hesitated, as if the room had a last word, and he wanted to leave space for it. "Keep the shavings." He nodded at the spiral by her cup. "They remind Wood where it came from." After he left, she tidied without correcting the day. 2 cups, 2 bowls, 2 chairs turned slightly toward each other, as if remembering. She found a small box and set the shaving inside, not as a keepsake, but as a sentence with room left for its verb. The rain ended after midnight. She woke once to the kind of silence that means weather has made a decision. In the dark, the house spoke in the polite vocabulary of cooling wood. Before dawn she rose and dressed in wool and resolve. The sky behind the pines had the faintest seam of silver. She wrote a note for the house on the corner of a scrap back by light and tucked it under the kettle as if a place could worry. Outside, the world held still enough to be taut. Each needle wore a bead of water. Each stone remembered its wetness. Her boots learned the path Pay's boots had learned yesterday. He waited where the trees opened. The lake lay below like a thought saved for the right listener. Mist drifted above it, not leaving, only moving to stay. They said good morning without adding more. Side by side, they let the quiet do the speaking. When the sun found the lip of the far ridge, the mist changed its mind. It lifted both all at once and in 1,000 slow decisions. The lake became itself. "You see," he said, "light is a person." She nodded. "And so is patience." They stayed until the first small wind gathered news from the valley and brought it up like a story told twice. Then they turned back, walking single file on the narrow path. The world knew in the ordinary way by consent. Back at the cabin, she stood before the south wall and made a second mark, lighter than the first, the promise kept. The room received it without argument. "Begin," she thought, and for once did not rub the word away. By the 4th morning, the cabin had learned her rhythm. It waited for the scrape of a chair, for the first hiss of the kettle, for the brush to tap twice against the rim of a jar. And, sometimes, it waited for him. Pay came early, as promised, with a small toolbox and a loaf still warm from the bakery. He placed both on the table as if they weighed the same. "I brought company," he said. From behind his coat peeked a small orange cat, damp from grass and proud of it. It trotted in, circled once, and sat directly beneath the north wall's unfinished portrait, though it, too, had a claim there. Ju Chingy crouched. "She's beautiful." "She thinks so," he said. "Her name's Towsy." "Peach." The cat blinked in approval, then leaped onto the window ledge and began to dry itself with the dignity of routine. Rain had gone, but its memory lingered in the air, soft and deliberate. They worked side by side, her brushes whispering across canvas, his plane murmuring over pine. Every sound felt necessary, no louder, no smaller than needed. At some point she asked, "When you build frames, do you ever decide the size before the painting exists?" "Sometimes," he said. "When I trust the painter." She smiled. "Dangerous faith." He met her gaze. "Necessary one." By noon, the sun slipped through a clear patch of sky, touching everything like a slow revelation. The lake below the ridge glimmered between branches. Pei lifted one of the finished frames and held it up, measuring the air before her painting. "It fits," he said, almost like it was waiting. "Maybe the wood remembered," she said softly. He leaned it against the wall and stepped back. The frame didn't imprison the canvas, it completed its breath. Together, they stood before it, not as creator and craftsman, but as witnesses of something that had simply chosen to appear. Outside, bells from the chapel in the village began to ring. He turned toward the sound. "Market day, should we go?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The house could use more color. The path down to the village curled through pines and stones. Between branches, the world kept widening. People nodded as they passed a woman with bread in her apron, a man leading a donkey with flowers balanced in its packs. The air smelled of rosemary and soil. At the market square, tables overflowed with things the mountain gave. Honey thick as amber, wool dyed in quiet greens, hand-thrown cups that still held the shape of the maker's palms. She bought pears, soap, and a small coil of linen thread. He bartered for beeswax and sandpaper. When they stopped by the baker's stall, the old man behind it greeted him warmly. "You brought someone this time," he said, eyes bright. Pei scratched his neck. "An artist," he said simply. "Then you'll need this." The baker handed Ju Chingy a paper wrapped around a loaf. "For thinking? Good bread helps with that." She laughed, surprised by the kindness. "Thank you." They sat on the low stone wall by the fountain, sharing the bread in silence. Children ran past, their laughter scattering like coins. A little girl stopped, pointed at Ju Qingji's fingers stained faintly blue. "Are you a painter?" "Yes," Ju Qingji said. "Trying to be?" The girl nodded with absolute confidence. "Then the world will look better soon." And she ran off before thanks could catch her. Pei watched her go. "She's right," he said. "About what? That the world looks better when someone tries." By the time they returned, the day had thinned into a softer light, the kind that doesn't insist on being noticed. The cat greeted them with a single meow, as if counting attendance. Ju Qingyi unpacked her things and turned toward the framed canvas on the south wall. The wood, now dry, had darkened slightly, rich with quiet gold. "It's strange," she said. "I thought finishing would feel like closure. It feels like breathing out." He nodded. "That's what repair does. It lets the air in again." They stood together in that small room while light moved, slow and honest, across the floor. And for the first time since arriving, she no longer felt like a guest inside the silence. The wind changed that night, turning the pines into 1,000 quiet instruments. The cabin listened. Inside, the air held the stillness that follows work well done. Ju Qingyi sat by the table, sketchbook open, a cup cooling beside her hand. She wasn't drawing the room itself, but the way it breathed the shapes between things. Every line felt like a sentence she hadn't said yet. The door creaked. A knock wasn't necessary anymore. Pei stepped in, carrying a lantern that flickered like it was uncertain about belonging to the dark or the light. "It's from the shed," he said. "The wick's short and the glass is cracked. Thought I'd try to mend it." She smiled. "Then tonight's lesson is light repair." He set the lamp on the table. "If it listens?" They worked without hurry. He trimmed the wick with the same care he gave to wood grain. She cleaned the soot from the glass, turning each motion into something deliberate, as if intention itself could make broken things gentler. "Hold this," he said. She studied the lantern as he adjusted the wire brace. Their fingers brushed one small, accidental, yet precise in meaning. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves, like breath through a sleeping body. When the flame caught again, it rose slow and golden. The cracked glass refracted it, scattering pieces of light across their faces, like two versions of the same story told differently. "Perfect," she said softly. "It's still cracked," he answered. "That's why it's beautiful." He looked at her, really looked the way light does when it chooses to stay. "I think," he said, "most of what I fix doesn't want to be perfect. It just wants to work again." She nodded. "Maybe that's true for people too." The lamp hummed between them, a small heart learning its rhythm. They talked then not of art, or wood, or memory but of simple things. How the postman comes only on Thursdays. How the village dogs know when it's snowing before anyone else does. How the lake freezes unevenly, and the ice sings if you listen before dawn. Each word was a brushstroke on the quiet. Each pause, a kind of trust. When the clock on the wall marked 11, he stood. "It'll burn steady till morning," he said, nodding toward the lamp. "Thank you," she said. He smiled. "You're keeping it." "I am. It looks better here." She walked him to the door. Outside, the air had cooled enough to taste. Above the pines, the stars were half-hidden tiny holes poked through the night to let the world breathe. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll bring the rest of the boards. For more frames. For whatever you decide to begin." He left then, his footsteps folding into the hush of the mountain path. Inside, the lamp burned patiently. Its cracked glass painted the walls with soft patterns that moved when she moved. She watched the light, and for the first time since coming here, she didn't feel alone inside the quiet. She drew one more line in her sketchbook, 2 hands, close but not touching, and beneath it wrote a small note to herself. Sometimes, light repairs people too. Morning came slow, stitched with the scent of wet pine and fresh bread. The lamp still glowed faintly on the table, its cracked glass now tinted amber by the dawn. Ju-Chingi woke before the sun had cleared the ridge. She poured water, lit the stove, and let the room gather itself around the quiet. Pei arrived not long after, carrying the rest of the wood he had promised. "Good morning," he said, setting the bundle down with the care of someone placing words on paper. "Your early light doesn't wait." The cat, Peach, stretched beneath the window, tail flicking approval. They worked wordlessly at first. He planed the last of the boards. She prepared the palette. The sound of each task seemed to answer the other. Wood smoothing into rhythm, paint mixing into breath. The first color she made was not bright. It was the pale green of pine needles under shadow, the kind of color you don't notice until you miss it. She brushed it across the lower half of the canvas. Pei watched, not intrusively, but like someone witnessing weather. "That's not sky," he said softly. "No, it's the silence between the trees." He nodded, as if the answer were enough to explain everything. As the morning light strengthened, she added strokes of ochre and gray tones of earth and distance. The painting began to breathe in its own tempo. When she stepped back, he was already holding one of the frames, waiting. "Let's see," he said. Together, they lifted the canvas into place. For a moment, it resisted as if the work wanted to decide for itself where it belonged. Then it settled, a quiet exhale. "There," he murmured. "Now it knows its home." She looked at the painting, soft colors, uneven but alive. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that things choose when to be finished?" "All the time," he said. "I just try not to interrupt." The words stayed between them like a shared breath. They had soup for lunch, the same way they had done before, simple, honest. Outside, villagers' voices drifted faintly through the trees. Laughter, a bell, the sound of a bicycle chain turning. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel apart from the world, it felt quietly connected to it. After they ate, she walked outside. The sunlight had turned the needles to silver. From this angle, she could see both the lake and the roof of the chapel far below. The wind brought the smell of flour, firewood, and thyme. Pei joined her, his steps soft on the earth. "You'll stay through summer?" he asked. "I think so," she said. "The house isn't finished with me yet." He smiled at that, one of those smiles that didn't need to be seen to be understood. They stood side by side, letting the warmth of day collect on their shoulders. Inside, the lamp rested cold, its light finally spent, but the room no longer needed it. Color had learned to speak again. By afternoon, the air had turned restless. Clouds gathered over the ridge, their edges thick and woolen, like thoughts too heavy to stay unspoken. Ju-Chingi had spent the morning finishing a sketchiest study of hands, one open, one closed. Now, the paper trembled slightly on the table, though no window was open. The mountain was holding its breath. Pei arrived without knocking. "You felt it too," he said, glancing toward the sky. "The storm?" He nodded. "First one of the season. It comes fast." The wind rose suddenly, rattling the shutters like an urgent messenger. He crossed to the windows, securing the latch while she gathered the canvases from the north wall. Rain struck a moment later, sharp, deliberate cleansing. They worked quickly, moving brushes, papers, and wood into safer corners. The cabin dimmed, the light thinning into a single, trembling hue. When it was done, they both stood still, listening. The storm's voice filled the space, deep, rhythmic, almost human. Pei smiled faintly. "Every storm here sounds different. This one's polite." "Polite," he shrugged. "It asks permission before it stays." She laughed softly, then let it stay a while. He turned toward her, and in that half-light his face seemed carved from the same patience as the mountain itself. He picked up the small lamp from the night before and lit it again. The flame wavered but held. Power will go soon, he said. Then we'll have this, she replied. They sat on the floor near the fire, the sound of rain steadying into rhythm. Outside, pines swayed like metronomes keeping time for the sky. For a long while they said nothing. Only the storm spoke for them, its cadence threading between their silences. Then, quietly, she said, I used to hate rain. In the city, it meant delays, noise, people rushing with nowhere to go. She looked toward the window, the glass streaked with moving silver. But here, it feels like a reminder that everything needs to stop sometimes. To refill? He nodded slowly. That's why I stayed after the last one. She looked at him, puzzled. You mean, last summer? He hesitated, then said, no. The storm that came before I left the house. The one that made me stay long enough to meet whoever came next. The room breathed with them. Thunder rolled once, low and kind. Juchingi turned her gaze to the lamp, the same cracked glass now shining steady. Do you ever wonder, she asked, if the things we repair end up repairing us? I don't wonder, he said. I count on it. She smiled, and in that soft curve was everything unsaid. Outside, lightning came and went without anger. The storm had found its voice and was already learning to quiet again. When it finally eased, the windows were lined with droplets like small, uncertain stars. The mountain exhaled. Pei stood, checked the fire, then said, There's something I want to show you tomorrow. If the path's clear, what is it? A place the wind forgets. She tilted her head. That sounds impossible. Maybe, he said. But you'll see. He left after the rain stopped. The night smelled of pine and clean slate. Juchingi opened her sketchbook and wrote one line beneath the drawing of the two hands. When the storm speaks softly, it's because it wants to stay. She closed the book and listened. The silence left behind by the rain was not emptiness, was a room that had been swept. The next morning arrived with a fragile kind of brightness, the kind that touches everything slowly, as though asking permission before entering. Juchingi packed a small satchel, sketchbook, brushes, a jar half filled with water from the spring. Pei waited outside with 2 walking sticks, and the calm of someone who already knew the path by heart. The trail's steep, he said, but it pays in silence. They started early. The pines arched above them, their needles whispering a language that had no hurry. Dew darkened the soil, and each step made a sound too soft to disturb the morning. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air became, until breath itself felt like a form of prayer. After an hour, the forest began to open. A light wind moved through the grass and then stopped as if reaching the edge of its memory. Here, he said, setting down his pack. It wasn't a summit, not quite. More a clearing carved between 2 slopes, with a view of everything and nothing at once. Below, the lake shimmered like a mirror breathing. Clouds drifted so low they seemed to rest on the trees. This is the place, she asked. He nodded. The wind always forgets to pass through here. You'll hear everything else, water, earth, your pulse but not wind. That's why painters love it. Their lines don't shake. She laughed softly. So it's a silence made for work. For listening, he corrected. They sat on a smooth rock, their knees dusted with sunlight. She opened her sketchbook, and for a while neither spoke. Only the faint hum of insects stitched the air. What did you paint here? She asked finally. Nothing, he said. I built a frame once, then left it empty. Why? He looked toward the horizon. Some things don't need filling. They remind you that you're already surrounded. She thought about that, then began to draw. Her pencil moved in slow certainty, shaping the curve of the lake, the resting clouds, the small figure of him sitting beside her. He watched her hand, not the drawing. It trembled once, not from doubt, but from the tenderness of precision. When she was done, she held the sketch out to him. It's unfinished, she said. He smiled. Then it belongs here. They left the page open on the grass. A dragonfly landed near the corner, its wings catching the sunlight like thin glass. For a moment, the entire clearing seemed to breathe together. Man, woman, mountain, paper, light. Do you ever miss the city? He asked. Sometimes, she said. but it feels smaller now. That's what distance does, he said. It teaches you the right size of things. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything that didn't need words. When the sun reached its highest, they began the descent. She left the sketch behind, pinned under a small stone. "Won't you take it?" he asked. "It's meant to stay," she said. "Like your frame." He nodded, understanding in the quiet way only certain people do. As they walked down, a soft breeze finally found them gentle, almost curious. "The wind remembered," she said. Pei smiled. Maybe it wanted to see what it forgot. That night, back at the cabin, the unfinished portrait on the north wall looked different. The shadows no longer clung. The face seemed closer to breathing. Ju Chingi stood before it, brush in hand, and added one single stroke of color across the mouth. Not a smile, not sorrow, just the quiet truth of being seen. Then she stepped back, exhaled, and whispered to the house, "It's finished enough." By the time the first leaves turned gold, the mountain had learned to breathe in longer sentences. Morning light came later now, softer, less certain of itself. Ju Chingi stood by the window, watching mist rise from the valley like smoke from an unseen hearth. Her palette had changed with the season, more ochres, deeper blues, the colors of endings that didn't hurt. A letter from the village council lay on the table. The annual art fair was approaching, and they'd invited her to show her work at the chapel hall. At first, she thought to decline. Then she looked at the north wall, at the painting that once watched her more than she watched it, and realized it was time. When Pei arrived, she held out the letter. "They want to hang something of mine," she said, half smiling. "Something," he repeated, eyes glinting. "Or someone." She laughed. "That too." He studied the painting. The soft green from the pines, the gray of distance, the faint mouth now carrying a calm that didn't need words. "She's ready," he said simply. They spent the next day preparing the frame together, tightening joints, polishing the glass until it caught the morning light like a kept promise. The cat, Peach, sat on the table as overseer, tail moving in slow approval. When they finally carried the painting down to the village, the path felt different, not a descent, but a procession. The trees watched, the air listened, and the world seemed to open just enough to let them pass. The chapel hall smelled of wood polish and candle wax. Villagers moved quietly between easels and tables. Some carried small sculptures, some photographs, a few just the memory of things they once made. Ju Chingi placed her painting against the west wall, near the window that let in late afternoon light. Pei fixed the hook with his steady hands, stepped back, and nodded. "It belongs," he said. When the door opened and the first few people entered, she felt her heart steady, not from pride, but from relief. An old woman stopped before the painting and tilted her head. "She looks peaceful," she said. "Who is she?" Ju Chingi hesitated. "Someone learning to be herself again." "That's a good thing to be." The woman smiled, and moved on. As the day thinned toward evening, Pei brought her a cup of cider. The glass fogged in her hands. Outside, the sky burned in the slow colors of departure. "You did it," he said. She shook her head gently. "We did." He looked around the small room filled with other people's quiet attempts at beauty. "Strange, isn't it?" he said. "How everyone here is just trying to give shape to something invisible." She smiled. "And maybe that's what keeps us alive." They stood side by side, the painting between them. The light through the window caught the crack in the glass frame, and instead of ruining it, turned it into a thread of gold. For a long moment, neither spoke. The bell tower rang once, then once more, slow, clear, like a pulse that finally found its rhythm. That night, back at the cabin, the fire burned low, quiet and sure. Ju Chingi placed the small ribbon from the exhibition beside the lamp. Outside, leaves turned in the wind, and the mountain, as always, listened. She wrote one line in her sketchbook before sleeping. "Art doesn't heal the world, just teaches us how to stay while it mends itself." The morning of her departure arrived without ceremony. No letters on the table, no packed boxes stacked like punctuation. Just the house, breathing in its slow, wooden rhythm. Ju Chingi walked through each room one last time, touching the doorframe that had once jammed in the rain. the stove that still hummed from memory, the south wall where the light always arrived first. Outside, the pines whispered, their needles trembling in a language she now understood, a language without endings. Pei came up the path as the first bell rang from the village below. He carried a small wooden crate, tied with rope. "You're on time," she said. "I promised," he said simply. She smiled. "You always do." He set the crate on the table. Inside, wrapped in linen, lay a small wooden box, smooth and unpainted. "It's empty," she said, touching the lid. "For what you'll fill next," he replied. They stood in the doorway, looking out at the slope and the lake beyond. The air was clear in that rare way it sometimes is, before autumn gives itself fully to the cold. "Do you think you'll stay through winter?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "Someone should keep the house company." She nodded. "It likes you." He laughed, quiet and true. "It liked you first." For a moment, silence folded around them, gentle and complete. Then he said, "When you paint again, don't chase perfection. Chase air." She tilted her head. Air. The space between things. That's where truth hides. She memorized that like a last brushstroke that didn't need color. At the gate, Peach the cat wound around her ankles, then sat to watch her leave, eyes half closed, as if knowing every goodbye was only a change of rooms. Juchingi lifted her pack, the strap worn smooth by the summer's touch. The trail waited, patient and kind. She looked back once. Pei stood in the doorway, one hand raised in farewell, the other resting on the frame they'd built together. The house behind him glowed faintly, its windows holding the same color as the morning inside her chest. "Goodbye," she said. He shook his head. "Not goodbye," he said. "Just light changing rooms." That evening, down in the village, and she sat by the window with her sketchbook open. The last page was blank. She dipped her brush into the faint light from the lantern, as if painting with what remained of the day, and wrote a single line. "Some houses never stop speaking, they just wait for you to learn their language." When she looked up, the sky outside had already turned the color of pine smoke and rest. Somewhere above, the house still breathed, and in its quiet, the light stayed.